The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has been working on an initiative called Engineering with Nature. It all started in 2010. And this is the EWN Podcast. EWN is developing and implementing nature-based solutions for water and infrastructure projects. It's bringing together a growing international community of scientists, engineers, and researchers from all kinds of disciplines that are committed to harnessing the power of nature to solve problems. The EWN Podcast tells their stories. Now here's your host, Sarah Thorne of Decision Partners.
If you've ever walked along a beach, you've likely noticed the dunes, the mounds of sand that have been formed by the wind. But have you ever thought about what those dunes do and how important they are? Well, perhaps not. But my co-host and our guests certainly have. They're passionate about what they call dune stewardship, protecting and restoring the dunes that create coastal resilience for coastal communities, especially during storms and hurricanes. Welcome to Season 6, Episode 7. I'm here with Amanda Treitinger, Deputy Lead of the Engineering with Nature Program, and our U.S. Army Corps of Engineers colleagues, Duncan Bryant and Nick Cohn. So Amanda, you told me that the research Duncan and Nick are doing on dunes is totally cool and that we had to get them on the podcast. So here we are. I'm going to ask you to introduce them.
Hey Sarah, thanks. Yeah, I'm really excited about today's episode on dunes. Dunes are super important, and my two colleagues here, Duncan and Nick, have been doing really great and, like you said, cool work on dunes for a long time, and there's more cool work to come. So I'm excited that they're able to be here, and I'm grateful to get to introduce them. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Duncan Bryant first. He's a coastal hydraulics engineer at the Engineer Research and Development Center. Dr. Bryant conducts research related to nearshore hydrodynamics, sediment transport, and imaging measurement methods. His research is engineering with nature related. He's been doing studies in the field for a long time on quantifying the engineering services provided by dune vegetation in reducing wave erosion and the transport of sediment intended for beneficial use. Dr. Bryant typically employs the physical models here at ERODE, and he's in charge of most of our flumes. He's done a lot of great work on dunes, and I'll let him talk about it. Duncan, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Amanda. Appreciate you guys having me on today. Thank you, Sarah. I'm really happy to be here today to talk about something that I'm passionate about, and I'm so happy that Nick can join us too. And dunes are a critical part of our coastal zone. And so today, having an ability to have a discussion about them and their importance and some of the research that's going on is really exciting.
And also, unrelated, Duncan's a really good gardener, and every year he drops off a bunch of jalapenos at my door. Very grateful for that too. Thanks, Duncan. With that, it's time for Nick. Nick is a research oceanographer. And he also works at ERODE in the Coastal Hydraulics Laboratory over at the Field Research Facility in Duck, North Carolina. His background is in earth sciences, and he has a doctorate in geology from Oregon State University. And his dissertation focused mostly on the coastal ecomorphodynamics at the dune. What's really interesting about these two folks we have on today is Duncan's worked a lot on the East Coast, where we see dunes having erosion issues. Nick's done a lot of work out on the West Coast, where we see accretion issues at the dunes. So he'll tell us more about that. Nick's background focuses mostly in advancing quantitative capabilities through simulations of the dunes, capturing the evolution of dunes and the tundra backed in the coastal systems across time scales of hours into decades. Nick, thanks for coming on. We're excited to have you.
Thanks. I'm also very excited to talk about dunes today, and I think having Duncan on board here to talk about lab capabilities is really great and synergistic with some of my background focused on field research and also advancing numerical tools for the Corps to be able to predict dune dynamics across time and space scale. So I'm excited to dive into all these questions today, and look forward to the questions that come.
Wow. Well, thank you and welcome both Duncan and Nick. We got a lot to unpack here. We got dunes and flumes and timescales and a whole bunch of other hydromorphology, all these things that we have to talk about. Let's start at the beginning and talk a little bit about your backgrounds and why you're so passionate about dunes. And I think maybe we should start with Dunes 101, Duncan. Explain what dunes are and how they're formed.
Yeah, so like I said earlier, they're a critical part of the coastal zone, and basically there's a number of things that occur to produce dunes. You've got to have wind, which I think is not untypical for a coastal environment. You've got to have a sediment supply, and then you have to have some type of typically vegetation. And the three of those things act together and can build what you referred to earlier as a mound of sand, but really they're much more complicated than that. And naturally there'll be multiple dunes, so you can have foredunes and secondary dunes. So there's a lot of things that go into dunes in the coastal zone, but in general, those are the three things you need. You got to have the wind, you got to have the sand, and you've got to have the vegetation, and all three of those together work to kind of create this mound of sand, as you said. And the last thing you would say is, like, when you look at the dunes, a lot of people think they're static, and because most people's experience with dunes is just, I go to the beach, I hang out on the beach, I see the dunes, I might have had to walk over the dunes, through the dunes, and they don't see any change. But dunes are, naturally a very dynamic feature in the coastal zone, as is the beach. And so they're not static at all. They can form and they can grow, they can be eroded, they can shift, and they're really a critical part of the geomorphology of our coastal environment.
Clearly, you're passionate about dunes, Duncan. Tell us a little bit about how you got interested in this whole field of study that you dedicated your career to.
Yeah, I think for me, most people, if they're excited about what they do, it's somewhat personal, and growing up in the low country of South Carolina, dunes are a typical feature that you see along the coast there. For me, my first experience with a coastal storm was Hurricane Hugo in 1989. I was a child at the time, but it was very impressionable experience to go through that. And so, naturally, even as I got older, that experience of Hurricane Hugo kind of fed into my desire to know more about what happened during these types of storms, and what were the impacts from peak to people, but also how did nature respond to such events. And so that's really that driving point. And so, early in my career, I thought I'd be like a structural engineer or something. But then I realized that buildings aren't meant to move, and that's not very exciting. So things that change over time or move, like water and sand and dunes, are much more, that dynamic nature of them is much more interesting. And so that's kind of how I found myself moving from kind of a structural engineering background as an undergraduate into a coastal engineering background as a grad student. So that was kind of the lead up to my desire to be in the coastal engineering field.
Oh, that's really neat. Thanks for sharing that with us, Duncan. We want to explore more about what you're working on, and we'll do so as we get through the episode. But I want to talk a little bit to Nick. Nick, I understand that you were recently out on the dunes on the east coast of North Carolina, and you were putting equipment out to measure the impact of Hurricane Lee just before the storm. So I've looked at a number of your papers. I know that's what you do. You get out there just before the storm. Tell us about your background and why you're so passionate about dunes.
Well, I think actually Hurricane Lee was a good example of, why we do research on dunes and some of the interesting things that we have to understand about impacts from storms to dune systems. And there's actually a lot of these storms in the Outer Banks and elsewhere around the country where we have big wind events during storms that actually grow dunes pretty substantially. And what we hear in the news all the time is about how storms erode dunes. And that's why they're so complicated, right? Is that, sometimes it's just about the details of maybe, if there was 1 foot more of storm surge, that dune would get eroded out. So we do lots of research, both in the field, in the laboratory, and with models, trying to understand what details matter about our prediction of dunes. So my thesis work, as Amanda commented before during my PhD, was focused on the big dunes out on the Oregon and Washington coasts, where you have big sediment supply, you have wide beaches, you have lots of wind, and pretty spectacular dune systems that are growing because of that confluence of factors. So, I've done a lot of work over the past decade on dune systems, and I think I continue to be really excited about it because they're just so complicated. It's about the complex interplay between wind-driven processes, about wave-driven erosion, about, the details of plant species and density. And the details really matter in terms of how dunes grow, how much they grow, the form that they take. So from both the research and application side, I think that's fun that there's so many complex factors that we're increasingly understanding the feedbacks between all of these portions of the system, but then there's a lot to learn as well.
I think that's really interesting, Nick. And people tend to overlook dunes and the role they play, especially during hurricane season. Dunes can make the difference, and they play such a big role in the defense of our coastlines during hurricane seasons. We're currently in one, so this is a very topical or extra topical meteorologic joke there point for us. We've already had many named storms this season. Could you just expand a little on what role they play during the hurricane or the extratropical storm events?
Ultimately, it's about topography in terms of protecting many systems from flooding. And we have a lot of really valuable infrastructure along the coast, all throughout the country. Dunes serve as a topographic high that prevents high water from even small amounts of flooding in terms of people's property, in terms of critical infrastructure. And they're a really cost-effective natural form of infrastructure to prevent from that flooding. And so we see dunes as, well, they are natural landforms all around the world. Anywhere you have sand and you have wind and you have vegetation as a form of stabilization. And so they're really common features all over the place. And what we increasingly realize is that in places where dunes aren't present, they can be really effective for limiting some of those damages. So as we go into hurricane season, or as we get through the end of hurricane season, I think we always try to make the case that, dunes are a really valuable form of coastal protection that really can be put almost anywhere throughout the world without hard structural solutions.
Just thinking about dunes as natural barriers is really, really important. Duncan, I want to pick up and talk to you. You've been a dune steward for some time. I love that title, a dune steward. Well, you guys framed it. I love it. So you've been working with the Army Corps of Engineers. You were working with the Army Corps when Hurricane Sandy hit the coast of New Jersey on October 29th, 2012. And that resulted in heavy rains, 80-mile-an-hour sustained winds, and of course, record-breaking storm surge. So as we were preparing this episode, you were talking about Sandy being really a turning point in how the Corps thought about dunes. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, you're correct. Superstorm Sandy, as we like to call it, was a huge event for the Corps of Engineers, and the rebuild, went on for many, many years. But the important thing was that after the storm, there was a lot of observational evidence that demonstrated that communities, especially along the New Jersey coast, that had significant dunes would sustain less damage than those that didn't. And it's provided kind of side-by-side comparisons that sometimes are difficult to see. So you kind of had, these areas where you didn't have dunes, maybe they had been removed for boardwalks or for other type of, for other reasons. And so, those areas seem to have a lot more damage than those that had these more natural vegetated dune areas in the front. And so it kind of gave the Corps a reason to say, well, wait a minute, maybe we should think more about including these moving forward and keeping the dunes in a position where they can be successful at protecting the coast during a coastal storm like Superstorm Sandy.
Absolutely. And I think it's really interesting. In season 5, episode 10, we had Mike Beck back, Mike is the director of the new Center for Coastal Climate Resilience at the University of California in Santa Cruz. And like you guys know, he's actively working to understand the role that ecosystems play in providing these natural defenses for people and property. So by combining innovative nature-based solutions, including dunes, with insurance incentives, he's hoping to significantly increase coastal resilience.
I think that's such an exciting prospect. The role that dunes play in coastal resilience is one that, it feels priceless, but quantifying it and putting a number on it, that's a great step forward. Everybody in the coastal community has some major storm event, some hurricane that, sticks in their mind for a long time. For me, it was Hurricane Matthew and Irma. For both, I was in Northeast Florida. And we did forensic studies before and after each one of those storms. And you could walk up and down the coastline and just see the communities that had these younger dune systems versus the ones that had these older dunes or these double dunes, the double dune systems that Duncan kind of mentioned in the beginning of the podcast. The ones that had these older systems, these more natural systems, those communities got out almost unscathed. Mm-hmm. Whereas the communities that had newer dunes or no dunes, or if you think about it, where you have dune walkovers, and we kind of take those for granted, you just walk over the dunes, that's a weak point. The communities that had those weak points saw a lot more damage after the storms, and they saw a lot more pause to industry. They saw a lot more destruction on their homes, their ways of life. So the dunes play a very critical role, and that's always stuck with me after seeing those two storms back to back. I think this is a great time to talk to Nick about some of his research that he's currently doing, but the research he's done on the different timescales and the ways that dunes can evolve to become stronger and provide more of a protection. Nick, could you just let us know about some of your findings from that research?
At ERDIC, we do research across a really broad range of timescales. So I do a lot of work on the physics of wind-driven sediment transport, thinking about how sediment is actually mobilized under individual wind gusts, and using in situ sensors and remote sensing devices to actually measure that in situ and understand when is sediment mobilized, when can actually contribute to dune growth. So that's really the processes that happen on sub-second timescales. But that all feeds into our understanding of long-term dune evolution, since we need to know exactly under what conditions is wind blowing sediment into dunes, and we use a lot of this information in the field to parameterize numerical models to prove our understanding of physics and predictive capabilities. So at the moment, a lot of my work is on developing capabilities in numerical tools. We work extensively with a range of different models like Aeolus and Seashore to understand both the growth and the erosion of dune systems. And we've been doing a lot of R&D to actually couple these different tools together so that we can extend timescales. And so what I mean is that traditionally we've had different tools that have simulated how dunes grow, the interplay between ecological processes and wind-driven processes, and then separately we have tools that try to predict wave-driven processes, whether that's dune erosion or the diffusion of beach nourishments by waves. And where we're really headed is in trying to build unified tools that combine all these processes together, so that we have the ability to simulate coastal evolution across these timescales of both seconds, hours, and even potentially decades, so that we can better design resilient coastal systems. So that's where a lot of my research has taken place, in terms of basically upscaling our physics to try to predict longer term evolution of the resilience of dunes and beach systems.
So it's so neat. You're looking at these dunes as very dynamic models, and you're looking at everything from the size of the sand particles to the wind speed to, well, you're also using something cool called holographic technology to figure out how the wind is moving the sand and how the dunes are growing. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Talk about the holography of what you're trying to accomplish that with that, Nick?
Yeah, we have a very cool 3D camera that's based off holography, which more or less can take a flat image and recreate a three-dimensional field of individual sand particles. And so we've adapted technology that's traditionally been used underwater to try to start looking at wind-driven sediment transport processes. And we've had a lot of luck with that. And so I think you'll sort of see this as a theme throughout ERDIC is that we're pretty innovative. We try to take tools that have been used in other communities and try to repurpose them for our own applications. And so this is an example of that where we've leveraged existing capabilities and using them for new purposes to understand sediment mobilization by wind. One thing I should sort of comment on that I didn't mention before is that we're doing all this work, but it really relies on collaboration, both internally and a lot with academia. And so we really can't advance all of these capabilities without all this collaboration and leveraging a lot of work that's been done by other federal agencies and by other academic groups to advance all these tools and capabilities that we're talking about. So, Duncan and I can have capacity to do a lot of this research, but this is a really big topic. And so I think hopefully Duncan would agree that, this relies on taking stuff from all sorts of disciplines and different collaborations that we've developed over the years.
Yeah, collaboration is key. We're not the first to realize dunes are important and provide coastal protection. A lot of really smart people are doing great work in these fields. And all dunes are different too, so it's really important that different groups are doing different kinds of research and we can all come together and share. We're mentioning that dunes are important when it comes to coastal protection. Water is lazy. Just think about why dunes are important. That elevation, that time scale that Nick's talking about, building up the elevation, it's like building a border wall. We are keeping the water from coming in. And it's really important to understand what elevations we need it at and then understand how to work with those elevations. Use those tools that Nick and other collaborators are working on to best build our dunes. Another component to the dune system, though, is the vegetation. So the height is important, but we also want to slow the water down because when the water moves slower, it doesn't move over as rapidly. Slowing the water and decreasing the elevation that the inundation can move into is our two key factors to coastal protection. And to better understand that evolution of the height, but the evolution of vegetation and what performance benefits it is providing, we now turn to Duncan, who's been doing cool research on understanding above and below ground biomass on dune systems. So Duncan, could you just speak a little to the work you've been doing at ERDIC and with collaborators on dune vegetation?
Sure. We know that dune vegetation is a critical component to growing the dunes, right? It traps the sand, the wind-blown sand, and there's a lot of nuances to that, as Nick alluded to. But one of the questions was, how does it contribute to maybe reducing erosion during these large events? So that's really been something we've been focusing on in my group, is trying to understand that phenomenon. And so that is important because it's not only what you see above the ground. So when you see the grasses or you see the woody or whatever type of vegetation is on that dune, it's also what you don't see, which is what's in the soil, which is the roots and the biomass. Most vegetation along the dunes is the growth, especially in the foredunes, is stimulated by burial. So when the sand buries it actually stimulates the growth of the plant. And so you're continuously building up layers of sand and biomass as time goes on, as long as you're getting an accretion and due to the windblown transport. So it's very important to understand that even though we think of them as maybe sand only, they're really a lot more intricate process going on, because as there's biomass, then there's all these other biological processes that are happening too within the dune, right? There's going to be microbial activity. There's the funguses that live with those plants in some type of symbiotic relationship, and so these things can all have an effect on how the sand actually behaves during an event, right? So it's not as simple as just did the sand move. It's also about how it's kind of, I like to say it's kind of like having concrete without rebar. The roots are kind of like the rebar for concrete. So a lot of people know, like, oh, you got to have, I had a driveway poured and I had to have, some wire mesh or something put in there to make it strong enough. But so it's similar to that. But there's still a lot unknown about, how the benefits associated with that and how effective that is. So that's one of the goals that my team and I are working toward, is trying to understand and characterize those effects. And the reason that matters is because some dunes grow naturally, they've grown over time, they're well established, and then sometimes we rebuild them from scratch, right? Maybe there's been a big event and community comes back, and then we just rebuild them and we plant them, or we put sand fences. And so are those dunes different, or are they the same?
It's really fascinating work, Duncan. And I know that you're doing really, really interesting work at erode in Vicksburg to look at different structures, different vegetation structures, and how they act. I know you've got some really interesting work coming up to take that further with the University of Florida. Can you talk a little bit about that collaboration and what you're hoping to learn?
Yeah, so that's actually being led through my team, but through Miss Lee Provost. She's leading that, and the idea there is we've done in the laboratory, we've recreated dunes at a scale with artificial vegetation. But the key there is we want to bring a real dune to the flume and see what happens. And so we're working through the process now. How do we go out in the field, extract some dune, and bring that to the lab? Something that's been, that's grown and responded to nature in time. So when we get it in the lab, it's going to be a lot like, as close to the real thing as we can do without having to go out. Because it's very challenging during a storm, especially a storm with high water and high waves, to take some of these measurements. And a lot of dune systems are protected, right? We know they have huge ecological value. A lot of bird species rely on them, and so, but not a lot of opportunity to go out in the field and dig up dunes and work on them like that. Sometimes in very small sections, but so the goal is to try to get a more comprehensive response model based on those results.
Yeah, that research is going to be just state of the art. We're really looking forward to that, Sarah. So make a marker, because Lee Provost next year, next season, we got to have her on to talk more about that. I've learned so much about these microbes and how the dune systems work from that research task. So we'll definitely have to do. This is foreshadowing. We'll have
Absolutely. Stay tuned. We'll find out how the dunes do when they're in the lab.
There we go.
Before we wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about what's ahead for dunes. And Nick, maybe we could get you to start and talk about what are the future opportunities you see for dunes and dune research? What needs to be done?
Well, I think we've already seen the sort of natural progression of linking different fields from ecology and engineering and physical sciences together. And I think that's the trajectory that we're going to continue to see, is in terms of a really interdisciplinary collaborations that recognizes all the intricacies and complex parts of dune that we need to understand to, improve both our management of them, and then, better understand how they can be forms of resilient infrastructure into the future. Like Duncan mentioned before, details about how microbes matter. There's a lot of research that needs to be done in terms of understanding mycorrhizal processes and how they can reduce the real erodibility of dune systems. And I think continuing to take this sort of tiered approach that leverages our observations from the field in terms of how dunes respond during storms or to winds, doing controlled laboratory experiments where we can't run every scenario in the world, but we can really understand under a specific set of conditions how dunes might respond. And then understanding in numerical tools and advancing those capabilities to try to improve our predictive capability. I see leveraging all of those combined together and helping all the field laboratory studies and model advances all sort of leverage each other is really sort of the way forward. And I think that's the approach that through Engineer with Nature and other ERDIC programs we've already been taking. And then lastly, I think continuing this collaborative approach, working with some of the best dune ecologists in the world and leveraging across different fields. I think this communication across government, across academia, is really essential too in terms of research, so that we're not working in a research silo and we're taking the best information that's out there that people have been working on, and advancing over the past couple decades.
Yeah, the collaboration is so key to everything going forward. And I mean, the work you're doing is absolutely critical, especially with climate change upon us. We need to understand what's going on with dunes and how dunes can be used to protect shorelines. So really important. Duncan, how about you? What do you see for dune research? What's up?
Yeah, I'm really excited with Nick's and his team and collaborators group of timescales, because when we start thinking about decisions, especially for the Corps of Engineers, we're not thinking about an event. We're thinking about what is the probability, what's going to happen over time, and so that's really critical that we start to move in that realm. For me, it's always, I'm more of a process based guy, so I'm always looking at kind of processes and trying to understand in the lab, different processes that have happened. And so it's, one thing is, just continuing to move that up in scale, so that the models and the life cycle type modeling especially can come in play. So, that's the big thing, I think, is moving dune and dune research into a pathway that's more similar to how we do other traditional coastal structures today. And so that way it's easier for us to compare, a community that may have multiple options. They may have a dune option, they may have a seawall option, they may have a double dune option for coastal protection, and giving them the tools so they can they can decide, based on the modeling and the modeling that's similar, that what's the best option for them. So that's part of it, is trying to understand that and give people that option.
Collaboration on dunes is key, and we want all of these options, but we've heard the words processes and timescales a few times now. And while the dunes are one of our best lines of defense, they're our most sensitive lines of defense. They are the rebar to the sand cement, the sand concrete, but they need to be taken care of. So while you've heard some words from Dune Stewards now, if you've made it to this point in the podcast, I give you a virtual certificate. You are a Dune Steward. And it's your turn to collaborate with us and spread the Dune word, and let your friends and your family know that these dunes are our first line of protection. They're important. And if you see nice green plugs on your dunes and you see a sand fence, stay off the dunes. Be a Dune Steward.
Be a Dune Steward. That's great. I'd like to ask Duncan and Nick, what needs to be done to improve dune stewardship? What's your call to action? It's a good way to close the show. What's your call to action? Duncan, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's well known, and I think ASCE has done a study that showed that beach nourishment is one of the most cost-effective ways to provide coastal protection. And within the Corps of Engineer, a lot of federally recognized beach profiles that we reconstruct to, or we construct to during a nourishment, they don't include dunes. And ultimately, the amount of sediment out there, it kind of dictates how much protection you have. And dunes are our sediment supply for big events. So I just think we ought to communities. I would say don't look at the dune as a block to your view of the ocean, right? Or obstruction. They are there for a good reason, and they serve so many purposes, not just coast protection, but also for ecology. So we just need to think about that and figure out how to include dunes more in the design going forward for coastal communities.
Great. How about you, Nick?
I think Duncan summed that up pretty well. I think the main things that I would add is that, if we're adding dunes to systems that they don't exist anymore, obviously that's a change to the environment. And, we've talked a lot about flood protection services that dunes provide, but extrapolating on the sort of ecosystem services and other benefits that dunes provide as well is really, really important. And I think that public perception of dunes has been pretty favorable over the last decade in response to Sandy and many other hurricanes. And more than anything, I think we just need to keep up the lines of communication in terms of all these additional services that dunes provide. Whether that's for endangered species, for birds or for turtles, in terms of the improved aesthetics, in terms of the flood protection. There's just all these things that dunes provide that many hard structures can't provide. And one thing that I think we struggle with sometimes is that dunes are dynamic features, right? They're meant to erode and recover naturally. And so, when we see a dune that's scarped after a storm, it's actually doing exactly what it's supposed to, even if, in the short term, it looks like it's about to disappear. The fact that these are dynamic features is part of the design that, over short timescales, they may lose sediment in response to storms, but they should naturally recover. And so that's part of the communication challenge is that they are dynamic features instead of just, hard structures that aren't ever supposed to change. But I think as we move into this era of climate change and sea level rise that you talked about before, Sarah, I think it becomes all that more important to take these sort of adaptive management approaches. And I think dunes are a big part of that.
Absolutely. And I think it's so important to be communicating about dunes and communicating about their importance and their value at a very practical level to people that are living along the coast. So good for you guys for doing that for us. Amanda, I know this is something that you've been thinking about. What's your call to action to our dune stewards who are listening out there?
My call to action is understand the dunes. Take the time to learn the dune story. If you go to the beach and you appreciate that water, that place, that magical place where the water meets the land, where we get to touch the rest of the world, know the story of the dune. It provides that ecological benefit. It takes care of the communities behind it. And it is dynamic. It's exciting. Like Nick mentioned, it's doing its job if it's disappearing, and it's doing its job when it builds itself up. Just appreciate the dunes when you're out there. I just think if more people knew the dune story and told each other about it and knew just how magical that thing they walk over on the way to the beach was, that would just be a win in itself.
Well, thank you. I think obviously the three of you are very, very passionate about dunes, and you certainly shared that with us. Duncan and Nick, thank you for sharing the critical work that you're doing to really understand and protect and restore these very dynamic systems. And thanks for helping us understand this whole new kind of perspective on dune stewardship and what we can do to help protect the dunes and what the dunes are doing really to protect anybody that's living along the shores. So thank you for that. And I've certainly learned a lot, including about aeolian dynamics. Thanks for all the homework that you gave me, Nick. I now understand how the wind is moving the sand and changing the structures of the dunes, and that these are really living dynamic features. So thank you for that learning. It's been tremendous having you both on the podcast.
Thanks, Nick and Duncan. Colleagues, impressed, by your research all the time, but also friends. Thank you, EWNers, for joining today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us today. It was fun talking about dunes, as always.
Well, great to have you both. And Amanda, thanks for the great suggestion to have Duncan and Nick join us for this episode of the Engineering with Nature podcast. You were right. They are doing very, very cool work. And of course, thank you for being a great co-host. Let's do this again.
Yes, please.
And to all of you, thank you so much for listening. If you have any comments about this episode or anything else we're working on in the Engineering with Nature program, please give us a call or drop us a note. Details are on the Engineering with Nature website. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast, and we hope you'll join us again when we talk about engineering with nature.
You've been listening to the EWN podcast, developed by Sarah Thorne and Jeff King, National Lead, Engineering with Nature Initiative, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Now, for more information, you can visit our website, engineeringwithnature.org. The EWN podcast is produced by iContact Productions for the Engineering with Nature program within the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I'm Dave Trafford.